By the time it was over, the stock market would lose 87% of its value, and 1 in 4 American workers would be out of a job. By the autumn of 1929, the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange was the loudest room in the world. Fortunes were being made by the hour, on paper, and a young broker, named nothing in particular, threw his order slips into the air like confetti. A thin ribbon of paper, printing numbers faster than anyone could read, had become the pulse of the entire country. Somewhere beneath all the noise, a single telephone rang on an empty desk, and nobody had time to answer it. Welcome back to Dollar Cents AZ. Last time, a handful of men built a guardian for America's money in total secrecy, a new institution meant to stop panics forever. Tonight, we find out what happened the first time it was truly tested, and just how far the damage spread before it was over. Every economy moves in a rhythm, a climb, a peak, a fall, and a bottom before the cycle begins again. Most of the time, that rhythm is gentle enough that you barely notice it. This is the story of a cycle that was anything but gentle, a climb pushed further than any before it, and a fall that dragged the entire world down with it. Watch for 4 beats as the story unfolds: the climb, the peak, the fall, and the bottom. The 1920s had become a golden decade. The war was over, factories hummed, radios and automobiles filled ordinary homes, and it felt like prosperity would simply never end. A few cautious voices warned that prices had climbed too high, too fast. Almost no one wanted to hear it. This is the story of how that golden decade ended in a single catastrophic week, how the crisis then spread, year after year, into the darkest stretch of American history, and how the brand new guardian, built to prevent exactly this moment, struggled again and again to find its footing. To understand how it happened, we have to go back a few years to the moment ordinary Americans first discovered they could get rich simply by buying stock. America came out of the First World War richer and more confident than any nation on earth. Its factories, its banks, and its cities were the envy of the world. In a modest grocery on a quiet street, a shopkeeper and his wife listened to the same talk everyone else was hearing, that the stock market was where ordinary people were becoming rich. Stock tips came from everywhere now, from barbers, from taxi drivers, even from the boy who shined shoes on the corner. Radio carried the numbers into every parlor in the country. Buying stock had stopped being a Wall Street habit. It had become a national pastime. It wasn't only stocks bought on credit. Cars, radios, refrigerators, an entire new culture of buying now and paying later had taken hold. And it made the good times feel even more solid than they really were. In 1927, the Guardian's leaders made money even cheaper still, partly to help a struggling ally overseas hold on to its own gold standard. One official is said to have called it a little shot of whiskey for the stock market. It worked exactly as intended, and then some. On the floor itself, a new breed of broker was thriving, quick, hungry, and utterly convinced the market only moved in one direction. The real secret to it all was leverage. You didn't need the full price of a stock. You could buy it by putting down just a small fraction and borrowing the rest. In practice, that fraction could be as little as 1/10 of a stock's price. Put down $10, borrow $90, and a small rise in price could double your money, or a small fall could wipe you out completely. New investment funds multiplied by the hundreds in these years, each one borrowing to buy shares in the ones before it, trusts inside trusts inside trusts, piling leverage on top of leverage until almost no one could say what anything underneath was actually worth. As more people borrowed to buy, prices climbed higher and higher, further and further from what the businesses underneath were actually worth. The whole structure was balanced on borrowed money and borrowed confidence, a tower that only stood as long as everyone kept believing it would. And beneath all that celebration, a second, quieter depression had already begun. Farm prices had been falling for years, and out in the countryside, many families had never actually felt the boom at all. A few economists and bankers warned that a market built this way had to come back down eventually. They were mocked as old-fashioned and out of touch. For years, one quiet figure at the New York Federal Reserve had used the new Guardian's tools carefully to keep the system steady. In the autumn of 1928, he died, and no one of his skills stepped in to replace him. The Guardian, built in secret years earlier, was still young. Without a single steady hand at the center, its regional governors began to pull in different directions. By early 1929, the Guardian's board tried to cool the fever by making it more expensive to borrow. They raised the price of money itself. It barely slowed anyone down. People kept borrowing anyway, certain that whatever they made in the market would easily cover the cost. By the late summer of 1929, the market had climbed higher than anyone had ever imagined. On paper, almost everyone who had bought in was rich. In September, a respected financial forecaster predicted a serious break in prices was coming. Most papers buried the warning on a back page. In late September and early October, a few stocks slipped without explanation. Most traders shrugged it off as nothing. Quietly in Washington, the Senate was fighting over a different question entirely. A bill that would raise taxes on goods coming into the country higher than almost any time in the nation's history. Almost no one on the trading floor was paying attention. Slowly, a little more selling crept in each day than buying. The tower was swaying, just slightly for the first time. The trader saw the wobble too, and decided it was the perfect moment to borrow even more and buy while prices dipped. Behind closed doors, a small circle of the city's most senior bankers began meeting quietly, watching the tremors with growing concern. The newspapers themselves couldn't decide what to believe. Some insisted prosperity was permanent. Others hinted that something was coming. Quietly, the steward and his circle began preparing a plan, an echo of the one used 2 decades earlier, a pool of emergency money, ready if the market truly broke. On October the 23rd, in a vote almost no trader noticed, the Senate unexpectedly moved that tariff bill forward. Some historians would later point to that afternoon as the moment nerves on the floor finally snapped. Others believe the market was already far too fragile for any single vote to matter that much. And then October arrived, and with it, a storm that no one on the floor was fully ready for. On the morning of October the 24th, 1929, the opening bell rang, and the selling began almost immediately. Within minutes, prices were falling faster than anyone could process. Shouting turned to genuine panic. The ticker tape, built for calmer days, could not keep up. It fell hours behind the real prices, so no one truly knew how bad things had become. Outside on the street, a silent crowd gathered, staring up at the exchange's columns, waiting for news no one wanted to deliver. Inside, the steward and his circle put their plan into motion, the same kind of rescue that had saved the system decades before. They pooled their own money and sent a trusted broker onto the floor to buy stock publicly, in full view of everyone, a show of confidence meant to stop the fear. It worked for now. By afternoon, the selling slowed. The floor exhaled. It seemed the worst had passed. The next morning's papers called it a crisis averted, a dangerous, comforting story because the danger was far from over. The trader, relieved, told himself he'd been right all along. He didn't sell a single share. The market was closed for the weekend. Across the country, people waited, uneasy, for Monday. On Monday the 28th, the selling returned, and this time it was worse. Much worse. By the end of that single day, the market had fallen further than it ever had before in one session. Whatever confidence Thursday's rescue had bought back was gone by nightfall. The steward's circle tried again to buy and steady the market. This time, the selling simply swallowed it whole. The next day, Tuesday the 29th, became the worst trading day the exchange had ever seen. An avalanche of selling buried the floor. Added up, and in 4 trading days, the market had lost about a quarter of everything it had been worth. That was only the beginning. By the time prices finally hit bottom in 1932, nearly 9 out of every $10 of value would be gone. By evening, the ticker tape was running so far behind that it was still printing morning prices from a market that no longer existed. The order slips the trader had once thrown into the air like confetti now littered the floor as worthless paper, trampled underfoot. For everyone who had borrowed to buy, the bill came due all at once. Those who could not pay lost everything they had put in, and everything they had borrowed. In the modest grocery, the shopkeeper's wife opened a letter from her broker. The savings they had put into the market were almost entirely gone. By nightfall, the street outside the exchange, which days earlier had roared with celebration, stood in stunned, disbelieving silence. In a matter of days, an almost unimaginable share of the market's value had simply vanished into thin air. And a hard question began to form. A guardian had been built 16 years earlier, specifically to prevent a disaster like this. So, where had it been? At first, most people believed this was simply a stock market problem, something for Wall Street to sort out on its own. But the damage did not stay on Wall Street. It crept outward, through loans and investments, into ordinary banks in ordinary towns. A small-town bank, tied up in loans against falling stock and falling land values, quietly began to wobble. Depositors, remembering stories their parents had told about panics long ago, began to grow nervous all over again. By the end of 1930, a wave of bank runs swept across the country, the very disaster the Guardian had been built to stop. Part of the reason so many banks fell was structural, not just circumstantial. Nearly every one of these banks stood entirely alone, tied to a single small town, a single crop, a single factory, with no larger network to lean on when trouble came. Just across the northern border, a different banking system told a very different story. A handful of large banks, spread across branches nationwide, weathered the very same storm without a single failure. The difference wasn't luck, it was structure. At the Guardian's headquarters, officials debated. Some believed it wasn't their place to rescue every troubled bank, that the weak ones should simply be allowed to fail, and the excess of the boom purged out of the system. The great reservoir of emergency money that had been designed for exactly this moment stayed largely closed. The Guardian, still young, did not act as boldly as its architects had once imagined. Meanwhile, that tariff bill from the Senate floor had quietly become law, raising the cost of goods crossing America's borders higher than almost ever before. Other nations answered in kind, raising their own walls in return. Within a few years, trade between countries around the world had collapsed by roughly 2/3, and the American farmers and factories that depended on selling abroad had one less way to recover. In 1931, an even larger wave of failures struck. This time, some of the country's biggest banks went under. That same year, a major bank in Austria collapsed, and fear raced across Europe like a lit fuse. Frightened European banks and governments began trading their dollars for American gold, worried the United States might be next. To hold on to that gold and defend the Guardian's promise, officials did something that seemed to make no sense at all. They raised the cost of borrowing money right in the middle of the country's worst downturn in memory. It defended the gold. It did almost nothing for the millions of Americans who desperately needed money to be cheaper, not more expensive, and it helped trigger yet another wave of bank failures at home. Failures in one region set off fear in the next, exactly as it always had, except now, on a scale no one had ever witnessed before. On the shopkeeper's street, other storefronts began to close one by one, their owners unable to get loans, unable to sell, unable to keep going. In the cities, long lines formed outside soup kitchens and relief stations, people who had never imagined needing help now waiting quietly for a meal. Farms were foreclosed. Families lost homes they had owned for generations. The crash on Wall Street had become a crisis in every corner of the country. In January of 1932, the sitting president tried a new approach, a government lending agency built to pump emergency money directly into struggling banks and railroads to hold the system together from the top down. It kept some of the largest institutions standing, but it moved cautiously. It favored the biggest players over the smallest, and to many struggling families, it felt distant from anything happening on their own street. That same summer, thousands of desperate war veterans marched on the nation's capital, camping out in tents and shacks, demanding early payment of a bonus they had been promised for their service. For weeks, they waited peacefully. Then, in late July, the government ordered troops to clear the camps by force. Soldiers with bayonets and tear gas drove out men who had once worn the same uniform. For a country already reeling, the image of its own army turning on its own veterans became one more sign that something had gone deeply wrong at the top. By 1932 and into early 1933, a third and even more severe wave of bank failures struck, tearing through what little confidence remained. In total, thousands of banks across the country failed in those years, and millions of ordinary depositors lost savings they would never fully recover. By the worst of it, roughly 1 in every 4 American workers who wanted a job could not find one. It was the very statistic this story opened with, and now you know exactly how it got that bad. The crisis did not stay inside America's borders either. Beyond the tariffs and the run on gold, a global downturn now dragged other countries down with it. Even then, people argued about why it had gotten so bad. Some blamed The Guardian for holding back help it could have given. Others believed deeper forces, falling trade, a rigid attachment to gold, a decade of borrowed excess, were also to blame. By the winter of 1932 into 1933, the country had reached the darkest point of its economic history. Public trust in banks, in the market, and in The Guardian itself had nearly evaporated entirely. As a presidential election approached, the country asked itself one question above all others: who could actually stop the bleeding? A new president was elected in a landslide, promising bold, direct action to end the crisis. But between the election and his inauguration, the banking panic reached its absolute peak, as if the system could not wait any longer. On the eve of the new president taking office, banks in nearly every state had shut their doors entirely. The country's entire banking system stood on the edge of complete collapse. On Inauguration Day in March of 1933, the new president took his oath of office before a nation waiting, more anxiously than ever, for someone to act. Within 2 days of taking office, he made his first bold move. On March the 6th, every bank in the country was ordered shut, all at once, starting immediately. It was called a bank holiday. The idea was simple: stop the bleeding completely, then sort out which banks were actually sound before letting any of them reopen. Congress moved just as fast. Within days, a new emergency law made the holiday official and gave The Guardian and the government clear power to get sound banks back on their feet. Behind those locked doors, teams of bank examiners worked around the clock, poring over the books of every bank to separate the sound from the failed. A few days later, on March the 12th, the new president spoke directly to the country by radio, explaining in plain language exactly what a bank does with your money and why the holiday was necessary. It worked. For the first time in years, people felt they finally understood what was happening and, cautiously, began to trust the system again. When the sound banks reopened days later, something remarkable happened. Lines formed outside them again, but this time, people were lining up to put their money back in. It was the first of what became known as the new president's first 100 days, an unprecedented sprint of new laws and new institutions, all aimed at the same goal: never let a crisis like this happen unanswered again. In June, a new law drew a hard line between ordinary banking and risky stock speculation, so that the two could never again be tangled together the way they had been in 1929. And alongside that wall, a second guardian was created, one built not to protect the whole system in the abstract, but to protect the ordinary depositor directly. In plain terms, from now on, if an insured bank failed, ordinary depositors would still get their money back, up to $2,500 per account, no matter what happened to the bank itself. It changed everything. With their savings finally protected, ordinary people had no reason left to panic and empty a healthy bank at the first rumor. Around the same time, the new president also loosened the country's long-standing tie between the dollar and gold, a controversial decision debated fiercely at the time and ever since. That decision, and everything it set in motion for the value of money itself, is a story we'll return to on its own. New public programs also put people directly to work rebuilding roads, bridges, and parks, a visible sign that the country was moving again. Recovery, though, was slow and uneven. It would take years, not months, for the country to fully climb out of the hole it had fallen into. Wall Street itself was reformed too. Stricter rules on borrowing to buy stock, and a brand new watchdog agency were created to police the exchanges going forward. The trader, who had once thrown his fortune into the air like confetti, rebuilt a smaller, far more careful career on the very same floor.
Good afternoon.
In the modest grocery, business slowly returned. The shopkeeper's family never fully recovered everything they had lost, but they kept their doors open. On the trading floor, the ticker tape ran steady once more, no longer racing, no longer falling behind, simply keeping honest pace. The Guardian itself was reformed as well, given clearer authority and a clearer responsibility to act decisively the next time panic threatened, rather than hesitate. The Guardian's first great test had, in truth, been failed, but the failure itself forced the entire system to grow sturdier than it had ever been before. And slowly, Wall Street's trading floor filled with sound again, quieter, warier, but very much alive. So what should you take from all of this? A few simple truths that still matter enormously today. First, a guardian on paper is not the same as a guardian in action. Building the right institution matters far less than actually being willing to use it when trust is breaking. Second, borrowed money makes both booms and busts move faster and hit harder. The higher a tower is built on borrowed confidence, the further it has to fall. Third, protecting the ordinary saver can matter just as much as protecting the biggest institutions. A shield around your own deposit changes how an entire nation behaves in a crisis. And fourth, no economy stands alone. A bank collapsing in Austria, a tariff wall built in Washington, both reached all the way into that small-town grocery. In money, distance is smaller than it looks. Zoom out, and this entire episode was one giant economic cycle stretched to an extreme. The climb of the 1920s, the peak in the summer of 1929, the fall that lasted years longer than anyone expected, and finally a bottom, from which the recovery slowly began. Ordinary cycles are supposed to turn themselves around within a year or two. This one didn't, because cheap money, pyramided leverage, a fragile banking structure, and a hesitant guardian all pulled in the same direction at once, turning a normal downturn into the deepest bottom the country had ever seen. This isn't distant history either. The rules born from this crash are the reason your own bank deposits are insured today, and the reason markets have the safeguards they do. You don't need to fear the next downturn, but understanding how the last one truly unfolded makes you far harder to fool the next time euphoria takes over. Economists still argue over the exact mix of blame. How much came from the Guardian holding back money it should have released? How much from tariffs and a rigid attachment to gold? How much from a decade of borrowing that simply had to end? The honest answer is probably all three, tangled together. From a banking dynasty in old Europe, to a secret island off the coast of Georgia, to a roaring floor that fell silent for years, the pattern holds. Whoever shapes the money, shapes the world, and is eventually tested by it. And perhaps the quietest warning of all, the most dangerous moment is rarely the crisis itself. It's the golden calm right before it, when everyone has stopped asking hard questions. The Guardian had been strengthened. Deposits were finally protected. But one enormous question remained unanswered. What exactly was backing the money itself? Next time on Dollar Sense AZ, the ancient promise that paper money could always be traded for real gold, the slow, deliberate unwinding of that promise, and the day the dollar finally stood on faith alone. If you want to understand the forces that quietly shape your money, subscribe to Dollar Sense AZ and follow the series from the beginning. Thanks for watching. Stay curious and stay sharp with your money. I'll see you on the next one.